The labor of care in early modern England was a complex and multifaceted system deeply embedded in the social, economic, and political structures of the time. While care work is often viewed through a contemporary lens as an undervalued and feminized form of labor, its historical roots reveal a system that was essential to sustaining both households and communities. Early modern England, spanning from the late 15th to the 18th century, witnessed significant shifts in how care labor was distributed, performed, and perceived. The expansion of capitalism, the enclosure movement, religious reformation, and emerging medical practices all played a role in reshaping caregiving responsibilities. This documentary aims to reconstruct the labor of care by examining the roles of women, the impact of economic and political changes, the institutionalization of care, and the shifting cultural narratives surrounding caregiving. One of the most significant aspects of care labor in early modern England was its heavy reliance on women. Women were the primary caregivers within the household, responsible for child rearing, tending to the sick, caring for the elderly, and managing domestic affairs. These tasks were unpaid yet indispensable to the survival of families. The notion of separate spheres, which later dominated Victorian ideologies, had its foundations in this period, as women's work within the home was seen as an extension of their moral and religious duties rather than an economic contribution. Despite this perception, historical records suggest that women's labor was not confined to the domestic space. Many women engaged in caregiving as part of their economic survival. Midwives, wet nurses, and healers occupied crucial roles in the medical care system. Women in these professions often worked informally, earning wages for their services while still fulfilling unpaid caregiving roles in their households. Parish records from the 17th century indicate that midwives in London earned between 10 to 30 shillings per birth, depending on the social status of the family. However, such earnings were highly unstable and subject to regulation by male-dominated institutions, such as the College of Physicians. Beyond medical care, women also worked as domestic servants, a form of labor that was integral to wealthier households. Domestic service was one of the most common occupations for women in early modern England, with estimates suggesting that nearly 60% of young unmarried women worked in service at some point in their lives. These women performed extensive care work, including cooking, cleaning, nursing, and child rearing. Yet their wages remained meager, and their labor was rarely acknowledged as skilled work. Care labor was deeply intertwined with the economic structures of early modern England. The period saw the rise of wage labor and capitalist economies, which reshaped the way care work was valued and compensated. With the enclosure movement leading to the displacement of rural populations, many families found themselves without access to common land, forcing men to seek wage labor, while women took on additional caregiving responsibilities without financial compensation. The economic burden of care labor became particularly evident in times of crisis. The recurring outbreaks of the bubonic plague in the 16th and 17th centuries placed immense pressure on caregivers, particularly women. Historical records from the Bills of Mortality in London reveal that during the Great Plague of 1665, caregivers were in high demand, yet their work was considered dangerous and poorly remunerated. The plague led to an increased reliance on searchers, women who were responsible for identifying and reporting plague victims. These women were often elderly and from the lower classes, performing an essential yet stigmatized role in public health. Economic hardship also shaped the labor of care within poor communities. The Poor Laws, which evolved throughout the early modern period, placed the responsibility of care on local parishes. Workhouses and almshouses became institutions where care was provided to the destitute, yet the conditions were often deplorable. Reports from 17th century workhouses indicate that many inmates, particularly women, were expected to perform caregiving labor in exchange for shelter, effectively turning poor women into unpaid caregivers for the sick and elderly. Religious and moral discourses played a central role in shaping attitudes toward caregiving in early modern England. The Protestant Reformation, which swept through England in the 16th century, reinforced the idea that caregiving was a moral obligation rather than a form of labor that deserved economic recognition. The concept of charitable care was promoted by both Protestant and Catholic institutions, encouraging women, particularly those from religious orders or wealthy backgrounds, to engage in caregiving as a form of piety. Religious pamphlets from the 17th century often portrayed caregiving as a divine duty, particularly for women. One such pamphlet, written by Puritan preacher Richard Baxter, emphasized that women were naturally suited to caregiving due to their compassionate and nurturing nature. This religious justification contributed to the persistent devaluation of care labor, as it was seen as a voluntary act of charity rather than an economic necessity. The intersection of religion and care labor also played out in the rise of charitable hospitals and almshouses. St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, for example, was one of the earliest institutions to formalize medical care, relying on both religious donations and the unpaid labor of nuns and female caregivers. While these institutions provided critical services, they also reinforced the idea that caregiving was a moral duty rather than a profession deserving of fair compensation. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the landscape of care labor began to shift as medical knowledge became more professionalized and institutionalized. The rise of male physicians and surgeons led to the gradual exclusion of women from certain caregiving roles, particularly in the field of medicine. Midwifery, which had long been dominated by women, came under scrutiny as male doctors sought to regulate and control childbirth practices. The establishment of the Royal College of Physicians in 1518 marked a turning point in the professionalization of medical care, favoring formal medical education over experiential knowledge, which had historically been the domain of women caregivers. This institutionalization of care labor had profound consequences for the economic and social recognition of caregiving work. As male physicians gained status and financial compensation, women healers and midwives were increasingly marginalized. Parish records from the late 17th century show a decline in the number of officially recognized midwives, coinciding with the rise of medically trained male obstetricians. The shift not only redefined the gendered division of labor, but also reinforced the idea that unpaid domestic care was inferior to professionalized medical care. The institutionalization of care also extended to the treatment of the poor and elderly. Poorhouses, which had initially relied on informal caregiving arrangements, became more structured with the introduction of overseers and managers, often men who dictated the conditions of care. Women continued to perform the bulk of the caregiving labor, but their autonomy in decision-making was increasingly curtailed by institutional regulations. Reconstructing the labor of care in early modern England reveals a deeply entrenched system in which caregiving was essential, yet systematically devalued. Women bore the brunt of unpaid care work within households, while also engaging in various forms of paid caregiving labor that were often unstable and underpaid. Economic changes, religious ideologies, and the rise of professionalized medical care all contributed to the evolving landscape of care labor, ultimately reinforcing gendered divisions that persist to this day. The historical trajectory of care labor underscores the need to recognize and value caregiving as essential work, both in historical and contemporary contexts. By understanding its past, we can better advocate for policies that address the ongoing inequalities in the labor of care.